Hello, everyone. Welcome in this session on valuation, microplastic, and C. There is not much that we have to say about plastic. All of us knows that plastic is the blessing and curse of modern society. We are using plastic every day. In this precise moment, all of us has one or more object made of plastic. My glasses is one example. Is a very efficient way to produce because it's a very resistant material. It produce a very resistant product. So of course has dominated our modern society for a long time. At the same time, every year we have tons of plastic that we need to deal with. And some of this, unfortunately, ended up in the sea. And when it's in the sea, big plastic components, water bottles, shopping bags, are exposed to atmosphere events, and so they disintegrate and they become microplastics. So the key elements, key problem of plastic is this disintegration and this dispersion of microcomponent in the sea. And we are all concerned about this because it becomes not a local problem, but a global problem. So sea, of course, is a common pool and all of us experience this. In this session, we have three exceptional speakers. All of them, they will deal with plastic or microplastic management and strategies. They will cover modern society or modern places like UK or plastics that is in the global south, Indonesia. And all of them, they will present not just policy instrument and initiative to deal with plastics, but how the valuation techniques might support, but they're also challenging when we try to deal with this microplastic or plastic component. I will encourage, since now, the audience to use the Q&A session to pose questions for the presenters. We will answer questions at the end of the three presentations. And I also would like to encourage the participant to look and consider the IQ options that you have to vote for. There is about 1 hour and 15 minutes. And I like to raise the attention on the IQ because most of these IQ are related to sea and plastic. I don't want to spoil, of course, the vote, but please have a look and vote your preferred option. So the first speaker is Peter King from the University of Bath. We have about 15 minutes for you. Peter, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Silvia. It's delighted to be here today. I was here last year. Well, physically, I was there last year and maybe next year as well. But today, I'm just going to talk through some work I've done from my sofa over 3 lockdowns. And the plan is, talk about our work in microplastics. I'm an economist by training, so I'm going to talk about my kind of stated preference work. And I'm, more than happy to discuss how does that apply to SEA, how does that apply to UK REACH, and even if we want to talk econometrics, I'm happy to do that. Before going on, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who's been involved in the project. Some are on the call today, especially from the Environment Agency, kind of instigated the project. And it's been fantastic to have that interdisciplinary connection. We also had some input from CTPA, who are really valuable insight, which you, as an academic, you may not get otherwise. And I'm happy to talk through, how we kind of work that out and what we got. And also, supervisors Alistair and Lucy have been, absolutely invaluable and really helped put this together. So the plan is to talk about precautionary abatement, and I will kind of discuss what I mean by that. So if you cast your mind back to 2019, when you could go out without a face mask, the European Chemicals Agency did this very large proposal for a restriction on intentionally added microplastics. And there is some detail on the costs, how much does it cost to reformulate things? What about enforcement costs, all this? But on the benefit side of things, especially non-market, I didn't really find a lot of evidence so far. And I think the session today is, a fantastic example of how far we've come so quickly. But the kind of problem is we don't really know what are the benefits of restricting microplastics, or at least, what are consumers willing to pay for that. So what do? We ask people, what are you willing to pay to reduce microplastics in a range of contexts? And we find that across these different contexts and across different methods, consumers are willing to pay for some precautionary abatement. And I will, more than happy to kind of discuss sector specific and also what do I mean by precaution. So I don't want to recap the literature too much, and this literature changes all the time. And it may be that some chemists or ecotox people can update me on this. But the kind of consensus from my view as an economist is that we're uncertain about what the effects of microplastics are. If you say, what are the effects on marine life, we can know that with some level of certainty. But what is the impact on human health? We're almost at a loss. There's more evidence coming out every day. But what we're going to do from our perspective is characterize microplastics as uncertain effects, and also Silvia touched on, irreversibly released. So there may be schemes to recover microplastics from water, but currently those are not necessarily cost effective or even plausible. So we're going to look at this trade-off between uncertain effects and irreversible release. And this is where I start talking about precaution. So we think, given the possibility of future adverse effects and the irreversible release, anything you release today is going to be much larger tomorrow and going to still be there. We think precaution is a nice way of looking at this. And we also ask consumers, is there a willingness to pay for that? As I'm sure most of you know, there's a big kind of body of work in this area. Vic Adamovich did some nice work. Emmanouil and Roy Brower have done quite a few different studies on, drinking water and micropollutants. And then finally, there was a paper last year by Tinora Bate and a few others, which was a really interesting look at, what are people willing to pay to reduce marine plastic more generally? And I know some presentations later today will touch on that. But there's a few things missing from all of these papers, and we try and address it. And that's the valuation of microplastics in the context of this uncertainty and irreversibility. So we use two methods. I always find it difficult to know how to pitch a presentation at a conference such as this. And I'm happy to talk, more complex or less complex, but we use two very common methods. We use contingent valuation. We have two questions, and we also spend a lot of time talking about the choice experiment component. I'll go through those in depth as well, but the contingent valuation is more general. How do we deal with uncertainty and irreversibility? And the choice experiment is more specific to cosmetics, which is where we have that industry input. So what we do is we have a survey, which a lot of time on pre-testing, as anyone who's done this kind of work knows, that you have to really iron out as many issues as you can. And the key thing to know is we have both the choice experiment and the contingent valuation. And I'm happy to talk through sample size and how do we test this and what's the kind of more econometric aspects. But if there's one thing you take away, we do this survey, 670 respondents, we truncate that down, and then we have these valuation tasks. This is required by all the economists. We have a broadly representative sample. It's slightly older, slightly poorer, slightly more students, but broadly at this kind of stage, we're happy with how representative that is. That is important from the policy side. So what I'm going to do is I'll spend some time talking about the two contingent valuation questions, and I will talk about the choice experiment, and then I'll try and bring that together and relate how the willingness to pay we get from these tasks links to this uncertainty and irreversibility trade-off. So the first question is just there, and we ask people generally, what are you willing to pay for research into microplastics? This might be of interest to all kinds of people. And I know there's, huge caveats on this question, but the essential purpose is, what are people willing to pay to resolve uncertainty? And I can keep banging on about that, but that's the core problem in this question. We have quite a few protesters in this, a lot of people saying, I don't want my water bills to go for this. I don't think the money should be used for this. But we do have a medium willingness to pay figure there. By contrast, the second question, and we randomized the order, so maybe it's actually the first question, we ask about resolving irreversibility. And we just say, if there's a policy that upgraded wastewater treatment plants to reduce the number of microplastics going to the marine environment, and caveats to that, of course, and I'm really interested in some kind of socioeconomic analysis on this policy, even though, hypothetical. And we stress that to respondents. What we get is a willingness to pay that's much larger. We have fewer protesters, and we have larger willingness to pay. And that, I wouldn't say the magnet, it's the difference between the two that I'm most interested in. I know you can use them as benefit measures, and I do that somewhat later. But just for now, I want to focus on the difference between the two. And this difference is very robust, no matter what econometric trick you try, or specification, or order, or where you can break down the sample. We always find this difference between the two tasks, which we think suggests some kind of premium for precaution. So that at the individual level looks like support for the precautionary principle, and at the policy level that suggests, maybe we should do something immediately, maybe some precautionary abatement, as people kind of express higher benefits for that precautionary abatement, given this, trade-off between uncertainty and irreversibility. And I'm happy to talk to people afterwards about, do you interpret this as quasi-option value? Is there an option value here? To keep it kind of simple, I'm going to call this a precautionary premium. We find people are willing to pay a little bit more for precautionary abatement. But as I say, I'm happy to talk about that. So, as I said, we also do the choice experiment. So you're probably wondering, they've come into the survey, they've done these socioeconomic questions, they've done 2 contingent valuation tasks, and now we ask them a more specific case. So the contingent valuation tasks were very hypothetical, but this is a much more, realistic look at the value of restrictions. So we look at cosmetics. There's some history of microbeads being used in cosmetics and that regulation, but what we do is say, if there was a REACH restriction and you had to reformulate your products, now assume the substitute would be, possibly less effective, and you can define that in a few different ways, and we provide a lot of information, so respondents generally have the same idea about that. And we also assume that any reformulation would have a cost which can be passed on. Now, it may be that substitutes are less expensive, and it may be that in future there are, very cost-effective substitutes. But just for the purpose of this, we assume that, any reformulation based on a restriction would alter the 3 kind of key attributes for cosmetic products here. There's a lot of design on how do you communicate that? How do you break that down? Do people interpret it the same way? And I'm really happy to, go into more detail on that. But this is essentially what we do. We ask the 2 contingent valuation questions, this kind of more general uncertainty irreversibility issue. And then we come to the choice experiment where we ask, in a specific context, what are consumers willing to do? And, are they still going to pay for precaution? So this is, a full chapter of my thesis, and I've tried to put it in about a page. So there's plenty more I can speak to. But what we find is this marginal willingness to pay, and it's very, very small. It's marginal, we expect that. But a marginal willingness to pay for cosmetics that don't have microplastics in. So again, we can show that consumers are willing to pay for restrictions or reformulations that reduce the release of microplastics, in this case from cosmetic products. Rather unsurprisingly, we also find people have a significant willingness to accept for performance. And this is, just a bit of caution on the cosmetic side of things, and say, if you substitute out microplastics and the performance suffers, then there's going to be some associated, loss of benefits. But from what I've seen, and I'm, happy to talk about this, is the kind of trade-off between using microplastics and product performance or quality might not be as severe as first thought. And it may be that, a manufacturer is able to reformulate away from microplastics with very little change in product performance, but they may pass that price on, in which case then we're interested in that first row, that emissions marginal willingness to pay. So if you get kind of one thing from the presentation, and I'm more than happy to discuss, we find that consumers are willing to pay for precautionary restrictions or reformulations in a variety of contexts. So with contingent evaluation, we show that consumers have higher willingness to pay for precautionary principle. And in the choice experiment, we also showed that there's some willingness to pay for precautionary reformulation. So we've kind of done a broad look at how REACH restrictions would impact, or what consumers are willing to pay for REACH restrictions on microplastics.
Peter, you have 2 minutes left?
Just conscious of time, I just wanted to note some caveats, and I've got my email at the end, so I'm really happy to follow any of these up, and I've got a working paper out which should go through these in a little more depth. And I've also got some, stuff I haven't been able to fit in today, and some future work. And that is my presentation. I've left my email up there. I'm really happy to, send papers, discuss the premise, what we're going to do next. But I do hope you've enjoyed that. It's our look at the willingness to pay for precautionary restrictions. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Peter, for your interesting and fascinating presentation from both the methodological point of view and the application. The next speaker is Gaetano Grilli from the University of East Anglia. Gaetano, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Silvia, and hello, everyone. I'm quite glad to be here and present this work, this joint work with Barnaby Andrews of University of East Anglia and Tiziano Luisetti from CIFAS. And the work I'm going to present today is the results from a choice experiment about public preferences for different policies to tackle marine litter. So a little bit of background. This work was part of a wider Interreg project involving the countries in the European Atlantic area, and specifically aimed at providing policymakers with comprehensive evidence about the biophysical and socioeconomic impacts of marine litter in the region. So, of course, marine pollution is a topic that is pretty high in the policy agenda, and this is demonstrated by the number of different policies that have been introduced in the recent years and are planned to be introduced. So in this context, it is quite crucial to kind of better understand public preferences for those policies and also provide welfare estimates to help to inform the assessment and the evaluation of the policy action. And this is also important considering, as we are also seeing today in this session, that yes, research on this topic is increasing, but the evidence is still quite sparse and heterogeneous, and very, very variable estimates are found in the literature. So the main objective of the work I'm presenting today is to examine public preferences and willingness to pay for different policies tackling marine litter in the context of the recreational use of the coastal environment, and particularly focusing on understanding if and what is the trade-off between short-term immediate actions and longer-term prevention policies. And we also take a cross-country comparison perspective. So the three areas that we targeted in our choice experiment, in our survey, are the southeast and southwest of England and the west of Ireland. The three areas were selected because they are all located, geographically located in the European Atlantic area, and also because recreational activities and the tourism industry are quite important for the local context. And in addition, in addition, research on marine litter also shows that on the coastlines in these three areas, there are several litter hotspots. So this issue is a quite relevant one for local environmental policy, but not only. So after an extensive pre-testing phase of the survey, we administered an online survey, including the choice experiment, to a representative sample of roughly 500 residents in each of the three local areas. And of course, the choice experiment was the core part of the survey, and the attributes we selected, the selection of attributes was really guided by the interest to understand this trade-off between short-term immediate action, such as additional litter removal and cleanup of the coastlines, and longer-term upstream policies that could in some way help preventing the accumulation of litter of the coastline. And in this case, we focus on local deposit return scheme introduction and the enforcement of a ban on single-use plastic items. It's also important to note that we used two different payment vehicles. So we used an increase in annual council tax in England and an annual donation to local environmental organization in Ireland. This choice was mainly guided by stakeholders and policy makers consultation, and was also tested during the pretest stage, and was basically made to kind of try to mitigate the pushback and the protest answers that we could get in the Irish sample. So the levels were combined using a de-efficient Bayesian design that was informed by the results of the pretest survey. And each respondent was faced with 8 repeated choices, and each choice card was made of 2 alternative policy implementation and a status quo option. Here we have the summary of the mean coefficients estimated through a mixed logit model. And we can note 3 main things here. So the first one is related, we find a substantially similar structure of the preferences between the 2 countries, with a quite strong preferences for the short term. I'm sorry, I don't know why it's going. Yes, okay, I'm on it. As I was saying, we found a quite similar preference structure between the 2 countries, with very strong preferences for the short-term additional removal of litter, but still significant and positive preferences also for the longer-term prevention policies, and in particular for the ban on single-use, non-renewable plastic items. The second thing to note is also that in the Irish sample, we can see that respondents are slightly more adverse to not taking action against marine litter and slightly less sensitive to the cost of the policies. this, of course, is possibly related to a payment vehicle effect, but it's worth noting that we found evidence of a pretty different use and attitudes towards the marine environment in two samples, with Irish respondents being much more interested in environmental characteristics and also environmentally friendly activities. So we can say that Irish respondents seem to have more eco-friendly attitude toward the issue of marine litter and in general of the marine environment. As a last point, we also note that we found high individual heterogeneity across respondents. So we kind of tried to characterize this individual heterogeneity in the sense of segmenting respondents based on some individual characteristics. And we estimated some 2 classes, latent class logic models. And as individual characteristics, we used some information about the use of the coastal environment, about the experience with marine litter, so basically about the amount and type of marine litter noticed when visiting local coastline, and about this that we called environmental activism, so active participation in environmental activities such as litter cleanup actions and awareness raising events. Also here, a few things to note. So the first one is that individual characteristics seem to drive the segmentation of preferences much more in the English sample than in the Irish sample, where only this environmental activism is found relevant for segmenting the preferences. And this can partially support our interpretation that Irish seem to be a little bit more eco-friendly with respect of the issue. The second thing to note is that when segmenting respondents, most of them, slightly more than the 80% of them, is allocated to the class 1, which has a preference structure very similar to the one that we saw in the previous slide when talking about mean coefficient. So this kind of signals that there is a substantial stability and consistency of preferences for having more policies to tackle marine litter in the sample. And this is partially also supported by, if we have a look at the preferences of people allocated in class 2, who are, yes, more likely to choose the status quo option, but still, in general, have positive and significant preferences for introducing more policies to tackle the marine litter issue. Finally, here we have results from marginal willingness to pay values. And we can generally see, as expected after analyzing the choice models, that marginal willingness to pay for additional efforts to remove plastic from the coastline are generally higher than those for more long-term prevention policies. And for example, for the removal of 50% or more of additional litter from the coastline, the English sample is willing to pay between 20 and 33 euros, and the Irish sample is willing to pay between 25 and 45 additional euros. And this brings me on the difference, or on the consistent difference in the marginal willingness to pay between the two countries, with the Irish respondents having consistently higher willingness to pay with than English respondents. And again, this is possibly related to the different payment vehicle that we used in the two countries, but also here is worth noting that we made some tests and we found evidence of statistically significant difference only for the more short-term action and not for the longer-term prevention policies. And also we note that if we look at the confidence interval, they generally overlap between the two countries. So this is a good signal about the robustness of our finding. And finally, we also started to have a look at the welfare effect of policy bundles, and unsurprisingly, we found that an integrated policy of short-term and long-term action is, in almost every case, superior and preferred by respondents. So, concluding, our results show how there is a quite strong support from public for both short-term and long-term prevention policies to tackle marine litter, which is perceived as a very pressing environmental issue. And it's also important the fact that we noted similar preference structure between the two countries, and also when comparing two different modeling strategies. And finally, we also found some evidence about the effect of individual characteristics on segmentic preferences, in particular of this sort of environmental awareness and activism. So in terms of policy implications, mixed strategies and integrated strategies of short and long-term policies are preferred and possibly also needed. Our examination of the marginal willingness to pay values, we are pretty reassured that is quite robust, and we think that can be successfully used for policy evaluation and appraisal, and for example, in a wider cost-benefit analysis context, or as a benchmark for policy costs, introduction of fees, and so on. Because we found very similar preference structure, we can also think that regional approaches are a valuable alternative to more localized approaches. And finally, increasing awareness can have an effect to further strengthen the support for action against marine litter. And yes, that was my presentation. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Gaetano. Very interesting thought about long-term and mixed policy and heterogeneity of preferences. The next talk is Emmanouil Tyllianakis from the University of Leeds. Thank you, Emmanouil, is your.
Thank you, Silvia. Yes, so hello, everyone. I would like to present this piece of work that I did with Silvia while I was still working at the Center for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. So yeah, we're looking into willingness to pay for introducing latent traits to measure willingness to pay for mitigating marine plastic pollution in Indonesia. Now, on the topic of marine plastic pollution, and I'm sure this is not news to you, but the majority of waste that actually flows from rivers and from land into the ocean, the majority of that is actually carried by rivers that they will be found generally in Asia. And that, of course, mainly happens to countries that are coastal states. So in Indonesia, which is our case study, up to 1.29 million metric tons of plastics end up mainly from rivers into the sea every year. That problem, though, the problem of plastic pollution, is exacerbated by tsunamis and monsoons. So these tend to happen quite regularly, and also ocean currents, which basically kind of bring back waste that has been washed into the sea, and they bring it back into coastal areas. And actually, what is interesting from a policy side is that you find coastal states that are relatively sort of well off than others to actually receive more plastics than other states. So the countries that are less well off economically, they actually also receive plastic waste from other countries just by ocean currents and monsoon and so on. So that issue is rather large, and to deal with it requires action from all sides. So doing a study that looks into attitudes and preferences of people around marine plastic pollution, but also how much they're willing to contribute and their preferences for different management schemes is paramount. What we looked into was we did a contingent valuation survey, and what we were also interested in is in the use of these of latent traits, such as environmentalism and behavioral norms. These are relatively quite common. I mean, in just the presentations before, you heard about this sort of environmental attitudes and so on of people from people. And they have been increasingly incorporated into measuring and estimating their impact on willingness to pay. They have also been implemented previously in studies that look into marine plastic pollution mitigation and abatement. So what you will see in the literature is what we call in our work the two-step model, which is basically reducing the latent, introducing latent variables and statements, and then reducing them with multivariate techniques, and just adding them as regressors in your willingness to pay function. But you might also find what we call one step, and I'm going to explain how that looks just shortly, where you estimate all of these attitudinal questions and these statements, and you estimate them jointly in a generalized structural equation model system, and you estimate it jointly with your socio-demographics, and you see the impact on your willingness to pay. So we were actually interested in this work as well, and to compare these two different approaches, the two-step, the one-step, and see if there are any differences when it comes to applying that in a global South country. And by global South country, we consider countries that don't have the capacity themselves to conduct studies like this, that they might be statistically rigorous and they might take a lot of undertake and so on. So how you could actually do that in a global South country. So the model specification, I'm not going to stay long in that, but this is basically how it looks. And you get to, in your two-step model, you get your observable traits and your latent traits. Your observable traits is basically what you have in your basic model, and these are the three different models we estimated: a basic one, a two-step one, and a one-step one. And you get to, as I said, to reduce those factors, those statements into traits, and then you use them as determinants for your willingness to pay. This was the approach that we followed for our one-step model. We assumed that you have two latent variables here, the NEP, what we call NEP and plastic. NEP is statements coming from the new ecological paradigm. Plastic is statements that we have sort of collected from the literature. NEP measures sort of ecological attitudes, behavioral, environmental attitudes. Plastic estimates statements around behavior with use of plastics, and how people feel about the use of plastics and how they relate to them in an emotional way. And they are jointly estimated, and their impact is jointly estimated on the probability of accepting the bid in a contingent valuation example. So with the results, we got around 750 responses from across the country of Indonesia using an online sample. On the top right, you will see where the majority of the responses came from. Actually, they came from mainly from large population centers, also where you have large internet penetration as well. Our study was a typical, let's say, environmental evaluation study. Apart from the introduction, we had evaluation scenario. The evaluation scenario now, it was interesting how we came up with it. We asked for people for their voluntary donation for an independent organization to set up trash racks. Now, trash racks is, think of them as contraptions that sort of filter through buoyant plastic and waste in water or in rivers. So imagine it as a massive comb that comes through plastics that is actually sort of floating, and then this is being sort of disposed elsewhere. It's kind of like a rough and very rough method of just reducing a lot of waste from rivers. And then also the valuation scenario included sort of supporting waste banks. Waste banks now are something that is happening in Indonesia, which is kind of like a voluntary thing that people came up with because there's not really proper waste management and recycling in the country. It's very sort of broken down, like different areas do different things. There's nothing really sort of centralized that works across the country. So people have been finding this sort of waste banks as ways of sort of not just dumping waste outside of their house. We also included questions about attitudes with respect to the environment and with respect to plastics, the ones that I just showed you before with the NEP and plastic scales, and we ended up with a series of socio-demographic questions. We got responses from almost all of the main population centers and the Indonesian provinces. And in our sample, we ended up having more young participants than older participants, mainly because of internet penetration and use and so on. When it comes to our results, the respondents that answered our survey, they were generally highly educated. At least they have they have had a bachelor's degree, and we also obtained a nationally representative sample, a split sample between women and men. Our respondents showed actually high levels of environmentalism and concern and sensitivity around the issue of handling plastics, which was encouraging. But also what we actually ended up finding was that there was some lack of understanding from the participants' point of view, based on the long-term impacts of plastic pollution. So people were concerned, but they weren't entirely sure of what is happening with the plastics, what is the life cycle of plastics. If a plastic sort of material goes into the river, it doesn't just disappear. It will probably sort of come back to the shore. It will actually pollute the seabed and so on. So we actually found some evidence of that lack of knowledge. The multivariate techniques we used actually sort of help us reduce from the 13 initial statements that we had to 11. And we used that to measure our two latent components, our two latent traits. And actually the statements are sort of grouped the way that we initially planned. They were actually grouped into these two different components. We actually found that 76% of our sample was willing to pay at least some amount for marine plastic pollution, which was, again, sort of relatively high and encouraging. Now, when it comes to the different models and the estimates that came from them, so as I said before, we estimated 3 different models: a simple model with just the typical socio-demographics, a 2-step model which we added to the socio-demographics our latent traits or latent variables, our 2 constructs, the NEP construct and the plastic construct, and then a 1-step model where all of these latent variables are actually simultaneously estimated in a generalized structural equation model, a non-linear model. GSIM allows us to do that, and then measuring the impact on the probability of accepting the bid. So in a simple model, our variables they had the expected sign, and by that I mean sort of highly educated. The more educated people were, the more likely they were to accept the bid. The more young they were, again, the same thing. The more likely to accept the bid. When we inserted our latent traits, only the NEP variable was statistically significant and had a positive effect, but how the model fit only increased marginally from 8% in the simple model to 9%. But at least we actually found statistically significant difference between the simple model and the 2-step model. Now, when it comes to what is not very used in the literature and what we wanted to test, this 1-step model, which is statistically more efficient because everything is estimated jointly. All the latent constructs were statistically significant, and the coefficient signs in the socio-demographics were the same as the 2-step model and the 1-step model. So there's a lot of similarities across the models, both in terms of signs. The signs didn't change across models of the variables. And now we looked into willingness to pay. Now the range was quite small. It was the average willingness to pay was between £13.5 per person per year in the simple model and £15 per person per year for both the one-step and the two-step models. We also had exactly the same confidence intervals. We also measured the income elasticity willingness to pay, which is basically the sensitivity of willingness to pay with relation to income. And we find that positive, but below 1, which basically means that if the policy was to be implemented in the country, if our hypothetical scenario was actually to take place in the country and people were actually asked to pay that amount of money that they indicated here, marine plastic pollution mitigation or abatement would benefit both high and low income groups, right? No one would benefit more or less than the other. And that's a good thing, right? Makes marine plastic MPP a normal good, which means everybody benefits from it. And this is good news. Okay, what does that mean then when it comes to models? We're looking into these one-step versus two-step models. First, our study basically indicated that these sort of behavioral attitudinal scales, such as the new ecological paradigm, in our case, they actually perform the same way that they perform in non-Western contexts. This is one of the main criticisms in the literature, because these scales have been developed in Western context, and this is where they've been refined as well. And there is this sort of discussion whether people in non-Western contexts understand the trade-offs, understand they have the same sort of value systems as people in the West have. In our case, actually, that it worked the same. So we can safely use them, and potentially sort of future studies in countries in the global South should be encouraged and at least trying to use these behavioral scales. Now, when it comes to
yes, just 2 minutes left. So if you try to wrap up, thank you.
Yeah. So here, when it comes to sort of looking into more complex models versus sort of less complex models, we actually find that complex models don't necessarily improve the model fit from the simple socio-demographic model, but that doesn't mean that they don't work. And environmentalism still drives willingness to pay, but environmentalism's impact measured by the NEP is less moderate than our socio-demographics, such as education or household size. So what does that mean then for policy? The average willingness to pay that we found is enough to cover the financing gap for waste management, which means that the financing gap, the global financing gap, is between $10 and $15 per person per year. Our estimates is between £13.5 and £15 per person per year. So that's enough to cover for the cost if the country wanted to actually implement better waste management. And our only sort of caveat is that our valuation scenario assumed that it's not just that you pay money to make the problem go away, but you also, as a participant, you sort of have a more active lifestyle of reducing plastic and having using less plastic in your life. And if you couple that with what we found, this lack of understanding about the impact of marine plastic pollution in the country and so on, this might not work very well together. So our finding is actually maybe education and awareness campaigns would actually benefit much more the country in order to capitalize on the intention of people, the preferences, to make the problem go away and actually have a bigger impact. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Manolis. As you can imagine, we have quite a very successful question for Peter. It was the first, but I would start the questions instead, considering that the three studies, both of them consider this bottom-up, so the citizen pressure on acting for waste management. And so, and of course, in this moment of spending, cut on spending from the government, I think it's very important to understand the pressure that the citizen can have on prioritizing intervention. So I will start from the second most popular question posted by H and supported by 7 people. And this is a question for the 3 speakers. And this question is related to consider if any media coverage on microplastic, so looking at the time where you were collecting your data, if you can spot any spike in your preferences. So if you look at this influence of media and coverage of plastic in your preferences. I think this is for all of you, so maybe I can start from Peter, who was talking precisely about microplastic, but would also invite the others to reflect on this. And in the meantime, if the audience wants to pose questions for Emmanouil, that of course was the last one, so at the moment has no questions, we can then move on. Peter, please.
Sure, thank you, Silvia, and thank you for everyone for listening in and putting your questions in the chat. I've got the chat on another laptop, so I will get round to those if we don't have time today. And I don't want to get in the way of the other speakers who've had some really, really insightful stuff. On Ece's question about media influence, so there's 2 things I want to mention just from the context of my work. Number 1 is we did the data collection in April 2020, which was a somewhat eventful month, so I'm not sure which way media influence works during that. But another more specific answer is that we have a question on how much of the Blue Planet 2 did you watch? We have 3 levels. We just say, did you watch none? Did you watch some? Or did you watch all of it? And obviously, there's caveats to whether that's a perfect measurement or, whether people are just kind of showing off and lying. But the result we have is that people who watched all of the Blue Planet showed, more willingness to accept a different option. They're more willing to choose that option for reformulation or restriction, and that's usually accompanied by higher willingness to pay and less protests. I don't remember the magnitude of the effect of my work off the top of my head, but we do find what Ece suggests, that when people know more, when they're exposed more to microplastics in the media, there's some more willingness to do that. And I don't know if that's too surprising, but it might be the magnitude that is interesting. And as I said, I don't remember that from my research, but I'm sure the others have some really insightful views on that.
Thank you, Peter. I will ask Gaetano to reflect on this.
Yes, this is a very interesting point, because indeed at the time we ran the CHES experiment, there was much more awareness due to the Blue Planet that also Peter was referring to. So the so-called Blue Planet effect on issues about marine litter and plastic pollution in the oceans and so on. And I didn't show in the slides because we kind of decided to focus more on a sort of more active participation into environmental activities, like direct participation in litter cleanup actions. But we had a question about watching nature documentaries, and specifically on watching documentaries similar and media coverage similar to the Blue Planet. And indeed, we found some sort of effect on of being exposed to this kind of media coverage on segmenting the preferences. So that is probably something that is strictly related also to the other thing that we asked, so about being an active member of environmental organizations, watching documentaries and being informed about environmental issues and so on. So yes, that had an effect on preferences.
Thank you, Gaetano. So it's clear that this awareness or campaign are important, something that Emmanouil concluded at the end of his presentation. Emmanouil, what do you think about this point?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't look explicitly into sort of the impact of media on willingness to pay, but we did the survey during the monsoon season actually when the monsoon season was about to end in the country, which is the time where you get the majority of waste actually sort of being washed either on coastal areas or through rivers as the water levels actually sort of rise. So you get to see more waste actually coming back from the ocean into living areas. And the majority of the population in Indonesia, around 75%, lives close to waterways, either through rivers or by the sea. So we actually look at whether the impact of just seeing more waste sort of impacts willingness to pay. We had questions asking people whether they saw more and how much more of plastic waste did they see. We didn't find any statistically significant effect that variable had on willingness to pay. So we actually conclude that it's the prolonged exposure from people to the issue that makes them more willing to pay. It's not a temporal thing that might either come from awareness raising through maybe media campaign or just by monsoon season, which then, the plastic might, be removed or be washed back into the ocean. But it's the long-term exposure that drives willingness to pay.
Thank you, Manolis. Given that all the other questions are more or less specific, I would take the last 5 minutes for all of you to reflect on this. There are questions about, did the people were understanding that we were talking about microplastic or talking about a specific intervention. So my last question for all of you is, if you were, or in this audience, let's suppose there is someone from DEFRA, Jonathan asked about this question. So if a policymaker or a civil servant is listening to your presentation and is looking into the diversity of your results, so we have £53 from research into microplastic, and we have £13 for annual management in Indonesia. How is your understanding or reading of your estimates? How would you suggest to take these estimates? Can we use this estimate in policy decision making? And if not, why? The validity and transferability is my question of your results. Peter, can you start? 1 minute each.
It sounds very difficult.
I know.
I kind of wish it'd gone the other way around. No, it's extremely important. And kind of transferability is something I had the back of my mind when I'm trying to get more into that and trying to understand it. Validity, I do a lot of work, and I see in Matt's question about, is it valid, this estimate? I mean, we do all the standard practices in the survey. We remind people, we have income questions. And for me, I'm not so interested in the specific value rather than the relationship between the values. And as I say, the willingness to pay for one question is higher than another. And then the implication from that is that the kind of individual benefits are higher following precautionary strategy. And I think that's the implication, which kind of skirts around Matt's question. But I mean, we do all the, standard treatments of uncertainty. We truncate the sample as well to really, make sure we get people who understand what they're doing and understand this. And I think that answers the question, but I mean, we have a minute, so I don't want to go on too long. Yeah, I will pass on to Gaetano.
So in terms of the understanding of the policy context, well, yes, we pre-tested survey, and we also were pretty much in contact with the policymakers in the two countries, because this was a very policy-oriented work. So we were making sure that respondents kind of understood what the issue was, and we really described the different policies and also kind of anchored to the marine litter actually found in the coastlines, in the local coastlines, so that people could really relate to the issue and the problem. And in terms of the transferability of our results, well, we are in some way reassured by both the similarity of the preference structure between the two countries and across models, and also by the kind of robustness of our willingness to pay values. And considering that we did this in two countries of the Atlantic area, and that in the wider Atlantic region, more or less biophysical and socioeconomic contexts are very similar, we think that willingness to pay, marginal willingness to pay values could, in a certain degree, being transferred in this wider region.
Emmanouil, you really have 1 minute.
I know, I can see it. Yeah. So I would say yes, it's transferable. In our case, we actually compared our estimates with estimates from other studies. So they're similar, not in terms of absolute values, but as a share of income. So willingness to pay as a share of income is comparable across studies. This is what we found, studies that were conducted in places that did experience marine plastic pollution. So the estimates are different, but in our case, we would say that they're actually comparable across studies.
Fantastic. You have been very efficient. So I will take the last 25 seconds to remember the participant to vote for the ICOS that is finishing in 15 minutes. And I want to thank the participant and also the speakers for the very interesting talk. And I suppose there is going to be a follow-up discussion with a specific question that was in the chat. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of the envecon session.